Thank you so much for having us. I'm Amanda Gutterman. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at ConsenSys, and I'm joined by Sheila Warren, who is Head of Blockchain and Distributed Ledger at the World Economic Forum. And Sheila, I just wanted to start things off by asking what you're most excited about in blockchain right now.
There's a lot to be excited about. I think I'm relieved that we're seeing an end of this sort of first bubble. The hype, I think, is dying down in a way that means there's a rationalization in this space. And we're starting to see a renewed focus, or perhaps a novel focus, on governance mechanisms, on tokenization, like sort of various mechanisms for focusing on things like citizen empowerment. And for me, that's something I'm very passionate about and very excited about, based in part on my background in civic technology, but also because it's one of the most, I think, exciting potentials that this technology has and brings to bear in the space.
So can you speak a little bit more to that shift in power dynamic that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me how many of us in this space tend to dodge around the word power. We don't want to hit it head on as a topic, and I think it is the core topic, it is the seminal topic, and it's where a lot of the disruption in this space is going to come from. So first of all, we have, when you think about a centralized system, there's an automatic power dynamic that's created there. There's a central authority, and even if you shift that into some kind of oracle context, there's still this idea that with the disruption and disintermediation that blockchain technology can bring, you're basically taking that power model and turning it on its head. So you're actually giving citizen actors or entities among themselves an equal stake and an equal ability to influence the system. So to me, if we don't talk about power head on, and frankly, what we're going to see is just a shifting of existing structures. I'm going to move them like half a step over, right? So there'll be maybe new people who suddenly have all the wealth and power in the system, but we're not really shaking anything up. And the other thing I think that's just, I think a little bit about centralization like entropy. There is sort of a human tendency, and I mentioned this in earlier remarks on the panel this morning, there's this human tendency to kind of want to have a pinpoint location for accountability. And so the psychological shift that people need in order to understand where accountability lies in a blockchain system, I think is not easy. It's not an obvious shift for people. And for them to put their trust in something where they don't understand the identifiable person they can blame or point a finger at, or in the States sue, it becomes a really interesting question. I know this is something that we've talked about quite a bit in terms of tokenization and sort of where tokenization can take us.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. This new infrastructure gives us the power to shift systems from how they've worked in the past in ways we've never been able to do before. And I think tokenization is super interesting on that front, especially when we talk about changing power dynamics and when we speak in a social good context. We tend to talk about individuals making sacrifices. They sacrifice their individual incentives in order to serve the commons, or they sacrifice the commons in order to serve their individual good. And we hear about that all the time. But one of the core kind of functions of a blockchain system that gets me really excited is the way that tokenization folds in individual incentives with communitarian incentives. So there's no more tragedy of the commons, so that you actually kind of hijack people's individualistic drives and use them to serve the public good. And a really obvious example of that is just simply with Bitcoin or Ether mining. The miners are obviously remunerated for securing the network. And so they're doing this public good, and they can be motivated to do that with a private good. And I think we can start kind of maybe even getting off a moral high horse in terms of conversations about whether we're doing good for the world or whether we're following our own kind of market incentives, and start collapsing that. And start creating categories of systems where serving your own personal interests is contributing to the success of the system.
I think that's right. And so to get back to your original question, what really excites me is the fact that we can really have those conversations in a more concrete way now. Because some of our basic infrastructure, while it still, of course, needs work, there's no question about that, and goodness knows we need more and more developers in this space helping us hone and refine protocol, but we also are really shifting into a focus on governance and what that can look like. The other thing I think, I spent a lot of time studying critical race theory, And one of the things you learn as a critical race theorist, which I am not, although I will play one today, is that bias, right? So bias is inherent in human beings. And one of the things I really appreciate about blockchain technology and distributed ledger is its ability to anonymize. Right? So one of the analogies or metaphors I use is that of the symphony orchestra. So symphony orchestras, quite a while ago, actually, to their great credit, realized that there was an inherent bias in the demographic makeup of a particular performer who was auditioning. And so what they did was they had people audition behind screens. So you couldn't see, as the judge, as the adjudicator, who was actually performing, and you based their performance or you based their advancement strictly on the quality of their performance and not on anything else. You also see this with names being removed from resumes, et cetera. Blockchain technology as a default just does that. And to me, that's a really exciting opportunity. Like, how can we actually think about leveling playing fields and addressing systemic bias using this technology? There's a governance component to that, there's a policy component to that, a technical component to that, and in my mind, preservation of those possibilities is something that we at the forum, and I personally am very committed to trying to achieve.
Do you think that, on that front, do you think that anonymity is the best way to counteract bias?
It depends, right? It's a really great question. I think one of the things, we have a project going right now that we're about to launch on anti-corruption. So we're looking at how do you balance anonymity and the need for authentication. So when you think about I'm a lawyer by training, so when you think about certain mechanisms by which we attain justice, right, or we attain not retribution, but redress, retribution at times, for grievances, right? So this is a classic example of something like in sexual assault claims. You do need to have in our legal system identified survivor and identified assailant, right? And so you may be able to create a system in which, and this is actually happening right now, there's really interesting work in this space, where you can actually log a complaint and it's kept anonymous until such time as, let's say, a group of people or an N number of people have logged a similar complaint about a similar individual or the same individual. And at that point, you can decide using smart contract functionality, like what gets revealed when and to whom, but you're able to address the power imbalance in the system via providing a group of survivors who together, at least the knowledge that there are other people kind of on their side, takes away the he said, she said, or he said, or she said, component to those kinds of dynamics. So in my mind, like it's a way of sort of thinking about an anonymity as a way of providing access to our justice system or to other kinds of systems where the power balance and that power dynamic is so problematic to the realization of the entire goal of the system.
And I think it also serves the goal of that system itself, which is to make high-quality decisions if it's able to remove its own bias. And I think something similar to the blockchain anonymity that you're talking about with funding, I assume. The same goes for supply chain. There are all kinds of problems on supply chains, workers not being treated appropriately, regulations not being followed, sweatshops, slavery. And so we have a blockchain supply chain solution called Viant. And we've used it in a lot of cases to help promote high ethical practices along a supply chain. And I think that being able to provide a decentralized system that isn't owned by the company that's running a supply chain is going to produce higher quality guarantees of ethical behavior, of quality, of regulation following, than having that supply chain management system be owned by one company and managed by it, and having that company be the one with the financial interest in making sure everything's okay, because you're not going to get people reporting problems.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that this is also a component of the token economy. So when you can actually create incentives for people to act altruistically or act ethically, it's a really interesting overlay on top of those existing systems that we have as well.
Yeah, so the flip side to anonymity is identity, right? Because blockchains have the ability, obviously, to, you can put out a white paper, you can do a token launch, you can do all of that bypassing the traditional venture capital system, perhaps bypassing potential bias, or at least legacy inequality, inequality of access to the legacy system. But the flip side is that people who don't have identity or who need identity or who need different types of identity can get it, and they can reveal themselves and come into themselves through blockchain. Can you speak a bit to how you're thinking about that?
Yeah, so to me, the aspect of identity that I think is most compelling for the work that I'm focused on from policy perspective is the ability of an individual to choose when and how to reveal information about themselves. And so there is, of course, your core identity layer, like that I am who I say I am, and there's your credential layer. So I may want to be able to prove that I have a law license or a medical license, or I'm a citizen of whatever state or country, and I can choose when and how and to whom I reveal that information. And with zero knowledge proofs, I can actually choose to prove it without revealing the information itself. And I think that is, the revolution that represents cannot be understated. It is a transformational concept in our world that there is not an authority you have to go to prove that you are who you say you are. I mean, it is just fundamentally transformational. And not just for people who have no access to identity or to paperwork or anything like that, to people like us, like to people who have many ways of proving we are who we say we are. So one of the stories I tell about when this really hit home for me is I was in the hospital giving birth to my first child when I was a victim of identity theft. So someone in the hospital stole my identity and used it to open all kinds of accounts. So I got home from the hospital with my first child. Again, so this was not at all traumatic. And I realized that I had like 14 calls from all these different banks, and why was I suddenly on this spending spree, this kind of thing. It was a disaster. So fortunately, I had invested in mechanisms to make sure that none of those had happened without my getting a phone call. So nothing, it was actually quite easy to unwind it. But what terrified me wasn't so much the hassle of potentially having to unwind this like money trail or whatever, which is a hassle, but there are mechanisms for that. It was the idea that my tiny newborn, somebody could have come in with a driver's license with my name and my actual correct information on it in their picture and claimed my daughter as their child. Right? And this is happening, of course, today. This is happening. This happens now. It happens in refugee camps. It happens in asylum situations. It happens all the time. And so when you think about the core of identity and what matters to people, it's the ability to actually map to your family, right? To map to people you care about. And when I think about the assets of my identity that are most critical to my sense of self, it's not my Harvard Law degree. It's the fact that I shouldn't say this on stage, but all due respect to my alma mater, which I love, but the network of people in my life, right, is actually far more, and even my acquaintance network, even probably like my LinkedIn connections, in some ways is more valuable to me in many ways than some credential that I have alternative methods of proving. So when you think about what really matters to people, the ability to say that I am who I say I am, and that my family mapping is what I say it is, and I have the authority to actually authenticate that, without some third party doing that is really, again, very, very powerful for the kind of ability it gives me as a person to move through the world.
But I think in terms of identity, property, and assets are also part of that equation. And one of the really interesting conversations I had a few years ago, actually on the summit boat, was with the with the former Prime Minister of Haiti. And he was commenting that in the 2010 earthquake that totally devastated Haiti, and he'd been the prime minister then, that the municipal buildings that had the paper records of the entire land registry of the country were wiped out, and there was no way to reconstitute them. Sorry. Is there water?
Water.
Excuse me. That there was no way to reconstitute this land registry. And there were 15 people coming forward. Excuse me.
This. Yeah.
Like 15 people coming forward for every one piece of land.
Yeah.
And so the government, thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
So the government wasn't able to maintain people's continuity of ownership of their property. And had that property been registered to a blockchain, it would have been easy for the government to be able to uphold its duty to its citizens, and that's really similar to some of the infrastructure that we've been building in Dubai. ConsenSys has been helping Dubai become the first city to run on a blockchain by 2020, which has been ambitious, and having a really well-constituted land registry is foundational to that.
I agree, and on top of that, I think that the incentives for people to invest in a place when they know that they have authentic proof of their property. So whether you're going to invest and build a business and you want to know that you're not going to be kicked out, or the landlord's not going to come in and say, oh, you're not really the tenant here, or whatever it is, or your home, that you actually own that plot of land and so you can invest in that community, it's really profound. So similarly, after Haiyan, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity was telling me that after Haiyan, again, all records were wiped out. And so in certain remote villages, they actually had it was really remarkable. They had the community come in and actually map out people's property, where they all did it in agreement. So it was a very grassroots, ground-up, community-driven orientation. So if someone came in and kind of claimed, like, oh, that was my house, you had all the neighbors saying, well, that wasn't your house. What are you talking about? So you had this ability to kind of do that. And they were saying if only we'd had blockchain, because then we could have secured that, because sad or not, as sad as this is, it's the truth that a lot of the places that are hit by these disasters are prone to being hit by disasters again, because they're in the wake of that kind of weather pattern, which is only presumably going to get worse as weather deteriorates in our world. So it's this kind of thing where you feel as an individual empowered to make that investment in that place, because you know that that investment is going to hold water and it's going to be authenticated on a system that can't be corrupted or erased.
And I think it's not just about registering the property that people already own to a blockchain. I think it's the ability to create property from nothing using identity. Because if you think about it, reputation becomes a type of property. You can start in a village that has no access to government infrastructure, that has no access to banking infrastructure. As long as you have a smartphone and you're able to access the internet, you can gather reputational attestations from your friends and your family members. Let's say people trust you to deliver water. Let's say people trust you to send messages. You can gather all of those reputational attributes around yourself on a blockchain, using a blockchain identity product like what we're building with Uport, and start building a really rich identity that you can then leverage in order to get a loan. And then you can use the Ether or the tokens from that loan to start a business. And you can actually execute all of the systems involved in running that business transparently using smart contracts. So the people that are funding you can see exactly how you're dispersing the money. And you can scale that business and build it bigger and bigger, starting just with a human kernel of your friends and your family and the people in your area that trust you.
Yeah, and that extends also, I think, to content creation. So there's a lot of talk around, particularly musicians, like how can musicians get fractional payments or micropayments for their work being distributed or used in various places. This is a huge issue. There's a lot of piracy and theft in this area. But I think even going beyond music, you can think about any kind of content creation. So I know like Civil's doing work around this with journalists. How do you actually authenticate journalists, and not just journalists from the New York Times or The Guardian, but also, or I suppose Fox News, but also journalists who are citizen journalists who actually are in these regions where traditional journalists are not able to penetrate, but they can actually be authenticated as being legitimate reporters on what's happening on the ground. I also think about this even in terms of like recipes, right? Like all kinds of things that are generated where you could actually monetize that. And again, that sort of economic empowerment model is really going to be upended in terms of how we value, and I mean that both literally and figuratively, like how we actually value that kind of contribution in our society. I think it is a known tragedy that many artists still are compensated more posthumously than they were during their lifetimes. And there's a way of actually addressing that problem and giving people more ability to do that, which I think is exciting.
I mean, that's actually how I first got into blockchain. I started my career in digital media, and I noticed that as digital media started and as content began moving online, we had democratized communications. We made it so much easier to create a story and share it. We'd lower the barrier to entry to creating a website or sharing a message or sharing a video. But with the move to digital, we decoupled the value from the creation. And so it made it really difficult for online contributors to get paid for their work. And something like a recipe, which you mentioned, how do you track a recipe back to its creator so that person actually gets paid for it? With something like music, and there are labels and there are platforms that do music rights that try and do this, how do you make sure a musician actually gets remunerated for their work? How do you make sure the bassist gets paid and the guitarist and the vocalist? We have a music platform called Ujo that's working on that problem, and there are some really interesting projects in the blockchain space that are working on video, that are working on movies, that are trying to make it easier for creators to connect with their fans. And eventually, I think we're going to see a world where the rent seekers that aren't adding value and that aren't actually connecting the two people that want to be connected meaningfully, if they can connect without that intermediary, then that's going to start happening. It's just kind of logic and efficiency.
Yeah. And I think it's been an interesting evolution. So if you take the music space, for example, first you had like YouTube and platforms that really democratized access and distribution. So you didn't have to have the ability, and here we get back into bias, and I will go into the obvious ways that bias played into who got access to record contracts, right? I think that's extremely obvious. And so you were able to kind of remove some of that and give access to the person in their bedroom with the guitar, to a platform, to a distribution, to an audience. And now we're moving into how do you monetize that? Right, because what YouTube, for example, is just not to pick on them, because I think it was a fundamental and foundationally important platform and still remains that to this day, but it wasn't about monetization per se, although there are monetization models on YouTube, obviously, but what it was about was kind of originally, it was giving people access to A&R who didn't have access to A&R, right? So you kind of eventually followed into this sort of traditional model where you then signed with a label, et cetera, right? And then that got disrupted quite a bit over the course of time, because YouTube's been around for a lot longer than, it kind of blows my mind how long it's been around now. But now you're seeing this ability to monetize that for the creator as well, right? And what I find fascinating is we know in Hollywood, for example, there are people we think about as super celebrities, but there's a huge pay disparity. There's a gigantic pay disparity happening, right? And there's a huge movement in Hollywood. The same thing happens in music. The same thing is really in every industry. There is this gigantic pay disparity based on gender and other characteristics. And so there's a way of addressing that. And it doesn't require anonymity, but it does require some sort of mechanism to ensure that the actual creator of a piece of content that is deemed valuable in the traditional ways by uptake, right, and by scalability or how it goes viral, you're capturing that in the right place. And so that I think music is the most easy way to understand that. It applies to all kinds of content creation across the wide spectrum.
Totally. I was on this, I was on a TEDx youth podcast recently, and I was told the audience was young teenagers, and they wanted to know about blockchain. And that was, first of all, that is awesome. 2 years ago when I officially started in this industry, that was so far from being a thing that could happen.
Yeah.
So it was so exciting, and the person who was interviewing me asked, what did I think about the way that teens and young people like myself are using social media, and what kind of advice I would give them, whether they're using it too much, whether they're addicted, whether it doesn't make sense. And what I said from the blockchain perspective is, it's not about the platform itself, it's about the incentives behind it. So every time you use Instagram or Facebook or any of the platforms you use, there are so many now, think about what the incentives are of the company behind it and whether those are aligned with you and to what degree they are. Maybe it's providing you something useful, maybe you're benefiting from it, but also think about how you're being productized. Think about who's benefiting from your usage, who's owning your content, who owns your data. Is it being leveraged for someone? Is it being leveraged on your behalf in a value chain that cuts you out? In a traditional software context, there's this kind of trichotomy between the company's shareholders and the users, and the interests of those three groups aren't always aligned. And this kind of gets back to the beginning, but what these blockchain-based systems do that really remunerate the creators is they collapse two of those categories. So you end up having the users aligned with the actual interest of the product, rather than sometimes having their interests be antagonistic to each other.
Yeah.
So my thought was just think about when you're the product, and think about when you're using it and when it's using you.
Yeah, well, if you're not paying, you're the product, as they say. But I think it gets to an interesting aspect of the power dynamic in some of these spaces, which still exists in the blockchain space, even though the potential, again, is there for that to be transformed. So one of the things I've been kind of calling out a little bit lately and asking people to think about is, particularly when it comes to highly sensitive, like biometrics, for example, who are we actually asking in some of our early experiments to provide that kind of information? Right? And what education are we doing with those populations around what's happening with their data? So there's a really there's actually an excellent use case, and despite what I'm about to say, I'm actually quite a fan of this use case, where in a refugee camp in Jordan, there are Syrian refugees, and it turns out that when you enter a refugee camp, you have to provide your biometrics to UNHCR. That's just something that automatically happens. So this particular organization came in and said, what is a way that, given that that's already happening, what is a way that we can actually provide access to resources for people in these camps in a way that will promote their dignity? Right? And so what they said, so right now in a refugee camp, the way it works is there's like bread day and water day and medicine day. And on that day, you line up and you go get bread, whether you need it or not, whether you want it or not, and that's what you get. And that's kind of your ration for the time period, which is not there's no dignity in that, right? You are really very much on the receiving end of someone else's decisions about what resources you need. So what this pilot did was have the ability to actually create well, let's call it tokens for lack of a better word here, where you could actually use those in kind of a store sort of model where you could go in and every day you got your allocation. You could go in and say, today I need medicine for my child, or I need more water, or I need shampoo, or whatever it is. But you could actually engage in a transaction that felt familiar to you and make choices about the resources that your family needed for its own welfare. And the psychological effect of that was kind of the point of the project, even though it's not very talked about very much. But the reality underlying it is that a very vulnerable population had to provide biometric data to get access to basic resources. And while that is a better outcome than was happening previously, there's a lot to unpack there that we had to be very conscious of. So I think this is a space where we pride ourselves on being very decentralized in our principles. We're all about empowerment, we're all about democratization, we're all about increasing access, but there are still power dynamics at play, and particularly at this time when we're engaging in really what are all very early stage pilots, even the ones that are in production are still quite early. I think it's really important to think about like who actually are we doing things to, and who are we actually empowering to do what? Right? Like those are different questions that are kind of flip sides of the same coin. And if we're not really conscious about that, if we don't publish that and talk about it and write about it and think about it, we're going to fall into old models where yet again, there is an exploitative class and an exploited class, right? Because this is the history of humanity. We've done this over and over again in industry after industry. We have a chance to do better. And so that's something that we at the Forum are trying to, again, call out, create accountability mechanisms for, and ensure that different stakeholder voices are included at this important critical time when we're still crystallizing, or developing, frankly, let alone crystallizing, let alone solidifying, like some of these protocol and policies that are going to govern this technology for decades to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to cap off our conversation.
Great. Well, thanks all.
Thank you so much for having us.